Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Twitch live recording of Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing a deep dive on the Arena Cube. But if you were so lucky as to listen to this before the weekend, I'm putting this out on Friday, you'll have a chance to listen to some insights and some conversation about the Arena Cube in time for the Decathlon finals. If you're not as lucky as to listen to it before then, well, hopefully we can still get some good Cube talks in here and get you prepared for some post-weekend Cube drafts, because the Cube is going to be up for a little while. So, and it's a really good time. If you are not somebody who normally cubes, and maybe you're just cubing because, you play the Decathlon and you got your tokens and you're like, oh, cool, I'll give it a try. I would really recommend it. It's definitely intimidating at first, but it's really a lot of fun. You hear a lot of players, especially a lot of podcasters, content creators being like, Cube is just like the best time you can have in Magic, and I do think it's true. It's a lot to learn and kind of recontextualize, but if you are on the fence about Cube, I'd really recommend it. And this iteration of the Arena Cube is actually, I've been having a lot of fun with it. That being said, I want to cater to a wide swath of people today. So we're going to do some Cube, just general Cube stuff for those people that are kind of like, well, I'm not so used to Cube. I don't really know where to start. I've had a lot of people in my Twitch chat kind of be like, oh, what are your, big 3 tips, essentially, for people who haven't cubed before. I'm going to give you some of those. But then, of course, I want to talk about just specifics about this iteration of the Arena Cube. There's been, 30 swaps, 40 swaps of cards, and I don't think there's been massive shifts, but there have been some notable things that have changed from the last iteration that I feel, play a little different, and we'll get into those. Before we jump into that, just of course want to give you a quick shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the place you can go if you want to support the show or support any of the content I make, any of my, my streams, my articles, anything you have read or listened to or seen from the Cord O content sphere that you like, and you're like, hey, I'd like to support this, I'd like to see more, that's the place you can go. Of course, we want to give back to you as many ways as we possibly can. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there, ranging from Discord benefits to coaching rewards to draft log reviews. I'm in the Discord all the time, the Limited Level Ups Discord, which I would highly recommend joining. It's a free Discord, bit.ly/join the Discord, or spelled with a CH like Corticals. Honestly, I have a great time over there. Everybody, I hope everybody has a good time over there. From the conversation, it seems like people do. But yeah, it's a good time, and it's a good place for learning as well. Just a quick shout out to anybody listening or watching Twitch chat. We are doing this live, of course, so I will be probably not paying too much attention to chat, but of course, we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end. So, if there's a few things interspersed here and there, I might take a look at them, but if you have any burning questions, anything you want me to extrapolate on, feel free to ask me at the end. And if you don't usually, or if you do usually listen to this podcast on audio, of note, every time I do one of these Twitch seminars, I stream the podcast as Twitch, I put it up on the YouTube as well. So if you're more of a visual learner, I've got PowerPoint to go along with what I'm saying here. That might be something that you're interested in. That's just Limited Level Ups on YouTube. You can search it. You can probably find it. Okay, let's jump into those big picture Cube thoughts. First of all, this is a very simple one, but I think a very important one. If you are new to Cube, or just like really want to make sure you're on the ball for this Cube, read all the cards. It's actually like, I know it sounds simple, I know it sounds stupid, but there's a lot of different cards from a lot of different sets, and one, if you're not familiar with them, and you go in and, you go to your, one of your first Cube drafts, maybe you don't go completely blind into the Decathlon, but you go in like it's your 4th draft, and there's probably going to be, 5 cards, 6 cards in the pack, you're like, I have no clue what this does still, right? Like, there's a list on Arena, right? You can just go to the event, click, look at all the cards, and it actually is a pretty, for as kind of dorky as some of Arena's interfaces are, the one for looking at the Cube cards is actually pretty good, and it's all just laid out there. Scan through the cards you're not sure of, do a reread. There are cards from all the sets on Arena, but also it's making this even, there's an additional level on this. There's new cards from Alchemy, right? Which is the arena only digital set. There's new cards from like Jumpstart cards from Jumpstart. So that includes Modern Horizons and some Commander products. So even if you've drafted every set that's on Arena, there's going to be cards that you haven't seen before, unless, you're really deep in, you're a Magic sicko like me. And I just know, like, all the cards from all the products, because I just love reading all the cards all the time. The other step on this, there's like a third level, is that a lot of the cards, there's not a lot of them, but there's a few cards in the set, I think 4, that have been alchemized. They're Alrund's Epiphany, Luminarch Aspirant, Asika's Chariot, and what's the last one? Cosmos Elixir, which don't worry about that one. Just don't put that one in your deck. But the other 3 have been nerfed, and they have different text than what you might be used to. So just big picture on this. It will take up a lot less mental bandwidth from you going into the cube draft. Just take 15 minutes, honestly. 15 minutes, go through, oh yeah, that's what that card does. Just have a good idea of what it does, and kind of give a rating, like a 1 to 10. Oh yeah, this card's pretty good, or this card's not so good. If you're not sure, maybe ask a friend, ask somebody in a Discord, hey, what do you guys think of this card? And that just gives you a decent baseline. And a decent baseline will help you make more clear-headed and informed decisions once you actually get into the draft. The second thing I want to talk about big picture here is Cube is all about drafting what you want to draft. Unlike a normal set, you open up a Hullbreaker Horror in Vow, right? And you kind of go, I got to take that. Of course, you want to take that. It's an awesome card, right? But in Cube, I would still recommend taking Hullbreaker Horror, to be honest. But if you really want to draft Mono Red Aggro instead, which is also a good deck, you could go, I'm going to take that Lightning Bolt instead of the Hullbreaker Horror. If you were predisposed to 5-color good stuff, you can take Fixing early. You can take Prioritized Triomes. The world is kind of your oyster because the power level of Cube is a lot flatter. Now, that is not to say that there are not better and worse things to do in Cube from a power level perspective. That is certainly true. But the range of cards you can reasonably take pick one, pack one is expanded a little bit because I guess, let's say there was a truly correct card to take pick one, pack one in every Cube pack, and I believe there is, in most packs. The next worst card would not be that much worse from a pure win rate level, right? Again, if you are trying to win in the Decathlon, I believe there are certain things you should and should not do, and we'll get into that. But if you are more looking to have fun and really just want to use Cube as a way to kind of express what you like to do in Magic, it's okay. Take that Earthshaker Kenra over that Doomscar. It's all fine and dandy. Okay, getting into these tips that, the big tips that people, if I had to give people just some quick hits of how I draft Cube and what's really important in Cube, is that cheap cards are so much better than expensive cards. And you hear this a lot from, if you've heard anybody talk about Cube, this is a big thing people talk about. But when everything is, again, relatively flat in power, the range of power is pretty small, the rate at which you can deploy your cards becomes very, very important, right? And so I would say 9 times out of 10, just take the cheaper card when it's close. And here's a decent example, I think. We have Magda, Brazen Outlaw, which, if you drafted Call Time, you know what this card is, but it's a 2-drop red creature. When it attacks, you make a treasure. Great card. Really one of the better red cards in the Cube. And we have Manaform Hellkite. 2 red, 4/4 from Vow. Whenever you cast a non-token or non-creature spell, you get a big dragon token, right? I think if you looked at these cards together, and you had to just say, hey, which one's more powerful than a normal limited set? Well, I would actually argue it's pretty close, but I think a lot of people would say the big dragon, right? I don't think it's close in this Cube, or in Cube in general. I think just take the cheaper card, because a 4-mana card is so much more than 2 mana. I've said this before on different podcasts, but I'll repeat it again. Mana in Magic does not scale linearly, which means a 1-mana spell is so much cheaper than a 2-mana spell, a 3-mana spell is so much cheaper than a 4-mana spell, etc., etc., etc. If your deck is just all cheap cards, you're going to have a pretty good time. If your deck is expensive cards, you're just not going to be able to cast them, or your opponent's going to have a counterspell for all your 6-drops, and they're going to completely out-tempo you, or you're just going to die to the mono-red aggro deck, right? This is also reflected in 17 lands a little bit, and now the 17 lands data for Cube is a little bit all over the place. We currently don't have good data for this iteration of the Cube, but you can still see some patterns. The cheap cards really outperform the expensive cards across the board. Sorry, I should mention, when I say that, I'm referencing previous iterations of Cube. I'm not just saying this Cube because we really don't have enough data yet. It's been one day. But across the board, the 1 and the 2 mana cards are just so good. So just, unless that expensive card you really believe is much better than the cheaper cards, just take the cheaper cards. And we're going to get into some exceptions. But one of the things that pushes you towards having cheaper cards as well, there's a lot of pressures that push you towards cheaper cards. One of them is this, that the interaction is really good in cubes, right? It's not like normal limited interaction where it can be kind of expensive, right? It's like 3 mana, 4 mana interaction spells. The good interaction in cube is like 1 and 2 mana. So when you tap out for your 4-drop that maybe doesn't do that much, like the Mana Form Kite, right away they go, okay, 2 mana, kill that, right? Or even just out-tempo you with some creatures. So you're getting a bad exchange on mana a lot of the time, especially if your expensive thing doesn't do something when it enters the battlefield. So be really picky about your expensive things generally. To add on to that, this is even more true in this iteration of the cube than it was previously, because as this cube just acquires, the biggest hits of Magic, or the best of the best, it gets more powerful. And generally, when a collection of Magic cards gets more powerful, that's really just shorthand for saying there's more power in the cheaper cards. You get more bang for your buck, right? Because good Magic cards tend to be relative to their mana cost. And the cheap cards, if you're just narrowing it down and cutting the fat, the cheap cards kind of rise to the top, essentially. Because the good cheap cards, you get a lot of bang for your buck, where the expensive cards, again, really have to do a lot to make up for the fact that they are expensive. The other huge thing that you hear about Cube, and I will repeat this, I'm a big believer in this, is a good mana base is critical. Absolutely critical. I think the biggest, one of the easiest ways you can lose in Cube is just have no dual lands for your color pair. You're just like, split down the middle, just a normal limited 8-9 mana base in your blue-black control deck or whatever. That just doesn't work in Cube for a few reasons. One, you can't stumble in Cube like you can in normal limited. In normal limited, you have a turn or two to breathe, where you're like, okay, I missed my black source here. Maybe my opponent's not pressuring me that much. I can kind of like have a few draw steps here. Not true for Cube, because your opponents are going to have more powerful cards. They're going to pressure you earlier. You don't have time to stumble. Two, in normal limited sets, they do a pretty good job of not printing a bunch of double pips cards at common. Because they know that people like to cast their spells, and casting spells feels good. In Cube, a lot of the cards are higher rarity cards, and higher rarity cards tend to be double pipped more often. Because just by virtue of double pip cards being kind of a way that they can, balance cards to, if you have a 1 white card, they can push it a little more than a 1 white and 2 colorless card. And so you're just going to have more double pipped cards in your deck, meaning you need to have better mana. 2, especially when you have, especially when you have a lot of cheap cards in your deck, this puts pressure on you to have a lot of the exact right mana, right? So say you have a blue-black deck with a lot of cheap interaction spells, maybe some cantrips, right? You've got some ops, some blue cantrips, and you've also got maybe a double black removal spell, right? That means that if you have 3 mana, there's going to be times you want to cast your double black removal spell and you're opt in the same turn. And if you don't have exactly that mana, that's, obviously going to cause you some problems. By virtue of having more cheap spells in your deck means, like in normal limited, you generally have, a white 2-drop and a red 2-drop, right? You can just cast those anytime. You don't have trouble fitting them in your curve. But since the increments are smaller, you have less leeway for the exact right mana you need. And the exact right mana you need is usually in the increments of like 1 pip, essentially. So it's really, really tricky. When you're drafting, and here's another thing, right? Because Cube is filled with more playables than a normal limited set, of course, it's great because you end up with 30 cards, 30 spells you can play. When you take lands, you just fill out more of your deck or more draft picks go towards cards you can play in your deck, which is awesome. That is all to say, you should prioritize lands highly. But then when people hear you should prioritize lands highly, that's a bit nebulous. It's a bit like, does that mean I should first pick them? Does that mean I should, where do I take them? And I don't recommend first picking like a dual land very often. Triomes and 2 cards I want to point out: Fabled Passage and Forsaken Crossroads. Fabled Passage is the fetch land that gets any basic and can untap it, kind of like in an Evolving Wilds, but if you have 4 lands, it untaps. And Forsaken Crossroads, which is an alchemy card, which basically it's kind of cool, but it's a lot of words. Basically, it comes in and you can choose a color when it comes in, so it's kind of like Fabled Passage. If you went first, you have the option to untap it or scry 1. And if you went second, it just comes in as basically a 1-color scry land. Both of these cards, Fabled Passage and Forsaken Crossroads, I believe are some of the top picks in the cube. Oh, sorry, chat says the other way around. My mistake. With Forsaken Crossroads, it's the other way around. Take a look at the card. It's probably going to be easier to to understand what the card does when you read it than me explaining it. But it's a very good land, just like Fabled Passage. They're in the same tier. I think Crossroads might actually be a little bit better, in fact. These 2 cards are great because they're going to fix you in any deck. And you can just take them early and be guaranteed you're going to play them. So that's those cards, because they're so flexible. I would not mind first picking these, second picking these, third picking these. They're just some of the best cards in the cube. When we get to Triomes, that gets a little bit interesting because so Triomes are the tapped 3-color lands. There's the Wedges, Jeskai, Sultai, all those ones. These ones are interesting because they're essentially a tapped land that if you take early, either enables a splash or can be just a 2-color land in your red-blue deck or in your red-white deck or whatever it is. Some of your decks don't want a tap land. Like your red-white aggro deck doesn't necessarily want a tap land, but it'll play it because you need to have good mana. So these are other lands that I'm willing to take early. When it comes to the duels, though, like the Watery Grave, the Pathways, Shocklands, Fetch Lands. Well, no, there's no Fetch Lands, but Shocklands, the Pathways. These are ones that you can either speculate on when there's nothing great in the pack. Like, say you're drafting a blue deck, right? You've picked Hullbreaker Horror into a few good counter spells and card draw spells. If there's nothing great for you, no good playables, I'll speculate on a blue duel, especially a blue duel that touches a color that I really like. Like, say it's like blue-red. I really like blue-red in this blue-red control, just for example. I'm likely to speculate on a blue-red dual land. The other time you really want to prioritize the lands is if like you're halfway through the draft and your color pair. You've already locked in. Then, like, if your blue-black, Watery Grave is one of the best cards you can possibly see. At the end of the draft, I basically want to have like 4 or 5 dual lands ideally. If I don't have those, I'm pretty sad. So basically, in order of priority, it's Fabled Passage, Forsaken Crossroads, the Triomes, and then you can speculate on the dual lands and then take those dual lands super, super high if you know that you're already in that draft or in that color pair. Sorry. I want to give a quick note on what kind of lands you want to prioritize in the aggro decks versus the control decks. It's very simple. The ones that come in untapped, like the Pathways and Inspiring Vantage type cards, which are the ones that come in untapped if you control 3 or less lands. Those are what you want for the aggressive decks. The ones that come in tapped, like the Triomes, Watery Grave, and the Shocklands are good too. But any ones that naturally come in tapped like early, like the new ones from Crimson Vow and Midnight Hunt, those ones aren't as good in the aggro decks because you really want your mana to come in untapped on turns 1, 2, and 3, essentially. Okay, another big picture thought I have here is making the transition from normal limited to cube. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, some of the differences, but this is one of the things that comes up a lot for people that don't draft cube normally. It's like, I jump into cube and it just feels like a whole different world, right? It's like, where do I start? There's so many good cards. How do I even know what to pick here? And there's a few things. Like I said, the mana base is really important. Cheap cards. I mean, I would argue it's great to take cheap cards in normal limited too, but in cube even more. And one of the things that really trips people up, I think, is where to value removal spells. So, in some cubes, like if you've drafted Vintage Cube or heard anybody talk about Vintage Cube, removal spells are kind of like okay there because a lot of your opponents are doing non-creature things, like they're doing Storm or they're doing like creatureless control or close to creatureless to control, and so you can't prioritize removal spells too highly there. But you still want some access to some for decks that do have creatures, post board especially. But in something like Vintage Cube, they're not as high of a priority. In this cube, I would say they're actually not like a high priority. They're not as high of a priority as you would think a removal spell would be in normal limited, right? But I'm pretty happy to take the best of the best removal spells pretty, first to fifth picks. And when I say the best of the best removal spells, I'm talking 2 in particular, and then I have like an honorary third. Lightning Bolt, Swords to Plowshares, and the honorary third is Lightning Helix. I believe Bolt and Swords to Plowshares are absolutely premium. Just 1 mana is so good. For those who don't know, Lightning Bolt is just, 1 red mana, deal 3. Swords to Plowshares is a single white mana, exile target creature, instant, its controller gains life equal to its power. Just the fact that these are extremely efficient makes them high priority. Like, you can fit in 1 mana anywhere. And even in the control decks in this format, like I was saying, some control decks in like other cubes don't really run very many creatures, but the control decks in this format, they have like Leer and they have like Hullbreaker Horror. So an unconditional removal spell, especially like Swords to Plowshare, is going to be really quite good. And then Lightning Helix, I give that the honorary mention because it's just really efficient and so good against killing, so good against the aggro cards. Lightning Helix, for those who don't know, red and a white for an instant, deal 3 damage to anything, you gain 3 life. Really awesome. A Jeskai control deck or something like that. Any deck that can cast it, maybe like a 4-color deck, or like a red-white control deck. Doesn't happen very often, but there's that. So those are, that's the premium ones. When it comes to like the higher tier of, the more expensive removal spells, like the 3, 4, 5 mana ones, there's not really 5 mana ones, but I mean, there's a few and those are bad. But when it comes to like the 3 and the 4 mana ones, you should prioritize like counter spells more. If you're drafting a blue control deck, generally counter spells over those. If you're drafting an aggro deck, you don't want too many removal spells. Something I talk about a lot when I've talked about this when drafting aggro decks, and this really applies in Cube, is that you don't want to be loaded with removal spells because you can just end up drawing awkward opening hands or the wrong half of your deck where you draw all the reactive stuff versus, a control deck. Or, even if you're in like a aggro mirror. I mean, removal spells are decent in aggro mirror, but you still want to be mostly proactive, right? And so since a lot of the good decks like mono red, mono white, or white aggro, red aggro, maybe not mono exactly, are proactive decks, you don't really want to prioritize removal spells that highly. When you're in red, and here's kind of a side point here. When you're a red aggressive deck, you do want interaction. You want, I don't know, so I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 to 5 cheap burn spells. But there's a huge difference between the burn spells that go to face and the burn spells that don't. So I want to compare 2 cards here. Royal Eruption, which is 1 in a red, sorcery, deal 3, kicker 5, deal 5, and Thundering Rebuke, which is 1 in a red, sorcery, deal 4 to a creature or a planeswalker. If you're drafting a red aggro deck, the things that go to the face, the burn spells that go to the face, are just so much better than the ones that don't. Even though, Thundering Rebuke deals more damage, it's so important for your removal spell to double as damage for, both because, it's just good to have something that goes to face to the flexibility of that. But in the creatureless or low creature matchups where maybe Royal Eruption, your burn spell is not going to kill big things, or especially in control matchups, you need that card to not be dead, right? So I feel I hesitate to say bad, but I do feel pretty bad if something like Thundering Rebuke makes it into like my mono red aggro deck, because it's just dead versus too many things essentially. Another big thing is Wraths. People were asking me, where do you take Wraths? Wraths are generally pretty high picks in normal limited formats for anybody but me. And it's like, okay, so there's a lot of Wraths in the cube. Do I want them? Do I want them in every deck, or should I take them highly? I believe Wraths are pretty important for the control decks. I think you really want like 2 or 3 if you can get your hands on them, just because there's a lot of really good cheap threats in this format, and a lot of times it's hard to just go 1 for 1 with removal spells. Like, even if you have a lot of removal spells, it's hard to go 1 for 1. Just going like kill your 2-drop, kill your 3-drop, because often what happens is when you kill their 2-drop and 3-drop, because the cards are so good, they're like rare level cards, they usually are like value creatures, right? So you kill their like Llanowar Visionary, right? They're like 3 mana, 2/2, enters the battlefield, draw a card, and you're like, okay, I have to kill that thing because it's a mana dork, but I don't feel so good about it, right? So you do need something that like is a catch-all removal, or wraths the board. Sometimes it's just awkward. You have an awkward draw where you stumble, and if you stumble, you just die. So yeah, in your controlling decks, really prioritize wraths. One I want to shout out actually that I've been super impressed with is Burn Down the House. All the wraths are pretty good, but Burn Down the House specifically, which is the 5 mana red one, deals 5 to every planeswalker or creature, or you can make 3 devils. It's awesome because that kind of card, one of the downsides of wraths is if you're like a control deck versus a control deck, your wrath can be kind of like, it ends up being like a 5 mana removal spell against their like one creature, or their creature that like they've made off of a planeswalker or something. But in the in those matchups, in the controlling matchups, well, obviously it's great in the aggro matchups, right? Just like 5 damage to everything's going to kill a lot of things. But the fact that Burn Down the House kills planeswalkers as well is huge. And the fact that if you need to pressure, it can make the devils. So I've been really a huge fan of that one. But the other wraths are pretty good as well. Don't play them into your creature decks. Like, I know, like, this is one of the things, this is one of the humps to get over as you're transitioning from normal limited to cube. Just don't play them don't play a wrath in your white aggro deck or your slightly, aggressive white deck. It's just too narrow of an effect for what your deck's trying to do, right? Maybe something I haven't explicitly touched on is in cube, you're really trying to draft a very focused deck where your deck is doing one thing, right? And that doesn't have to be a very specific thing. It just has to be all your cards are pointed towards the same general direction, which is aggression or going big over the top. And when you have a wrath in your aggro deck, that's just recipe for drawing a dead card against the control deck. That's just, you can't have that happen or you like die on the spot a lot of the time. So yeah, lean away from playing wraths and drafting wraths highly. They're good picks if you already know you're controlling them. I've mostly mentioned red and white removal spells. I want to touch on the black removal spells, and this gets a little bit into the card pool in general. The black removal spells are a little bit awkward. So one of the problems is that one of black's problems in general in this format, and spoiler, I think black is the worst color in the format, not by a ton, but I do think it's the worst, is that black kind of has this like half aggressive, half controlling thing where it doesn't know exactly what it wants to do. It's like kind of trying to do this like one mana 2/1 a bunch of recursive 1-drop creature sacrifice things, but also kind of controlling as well, and it doesn't do either of them all that well. And so if you're like an aggressive black deck, the red, like how I was saying with the red spells, with red decks, you really want to have your removal spells go to face. The black removal spells don't do that. So if you're a black aggressive deck, you can't have your removal spells play both ways, unfortunately. And that's kind of a problem. And in general, I think some of them are kind of just clunky. Like Vraska's Contempt is one of the decent removal spells that's just a little bit clunky. It's 4 mana. It's Feed the Serpent, essentially. It's 4 mana instant, exile target creature or planeswalker, you gain 2 life, right? I want to point out Infernal Grasp as one of the ones that does kind of is actually pretty good. It's 2 mana destroy a creature instant, you lose 2 life. Like just how efficient that is really makes up for the fact that like it doesn't play both ways. If I'm drafting a black removal spell, I really want it to either be extremely cheap or generate some sort of value. And often I want my removal spells in black to like come in the form of a planeswalker or like have some sort of value attached to them, right? Just like something like a murder. I don't think actual murder is in this cube, but like Mythos of Nethroi, which is like 2 in a black, destroy anything, or like you can pay black, white, green to destroy any non-land permanent. Like that's the kind of card that's just a little too inefficient and doesn't generate enough value. So I kind of shy away from those, especially because they're just like super reactive. Now I don't mind those kind of spells if you're like a blue control deck and that's just like you're reactive, like you're just splashing black removal spells, or like you're playing black as a removal spell. That's kind of okay. But I don't really like the black removal spells in those creature decks very much. And in general, I want my removal spells, this is just a big picture point. I want my removal spells to be either hyper efficient or have some sort of value, like Bone Crusher Giant, which is just one of the better cards in the cube. And not everything can be Bone Crusher Giant, I understand. But, kind of cards that approximate something that Bone Crusher Giant does, which is like a decent removal spell plus some sort of value. Another big picture thing when people are making the transition from normal limited to cube is I think it's there's a tendency to undervalue the aggro cards and to overvalue just like the decent value-y mid-range card, right? So like looking at the red aggro cards like Scorch Spitter, right? 1 mana, 1/1, when it attacks, deal damage to a planeswalker or player. It's very easy for somebody to be like, oh, I know that card isn't very good in normal limited. Why do I want that card? It's a 1 mana, 1/1. What does it do, right? But since mono red aggro is a really good deck, this is exactly the kind of card you want. The flip side of this is something like Morbid Opportunist, which is an awesome card in Midnight Hunt, or Gem Razor, which is like a 4 mana 4/4 trample reach. When it mutates, you destroy an artifact or enchantment. Like, you gotta look at those cards and be like, hey, it's pretty good, But they're a bit too, like I said, they're just a bit too mid-rangey. And not to say that mid-range decks are bad necessarily, but it's very common for these kind of cards to be overrated as like, oh, like I know how good Morbid Opportunist is. When Morbid Opportunist is the type of card that is really good in a long game where tapping out for a 3-drop that doesn't affect the board isn't punishing. That's not what Cube is. Cube is pretty punishing to a tapping out on turn 3 for a 1/3, right? So that's a little bit problematic. And again, not to say that these cards don't have a home. I think Gem Razor can be pretty good in like a green beatdown deck. I just know that a lot of players gravitate towards, big stats. I know that's got to be pretty good when the big stats generally just get taken down by like, again, those like cheap interaction spells and aren't that good. And this just goes back again to like value the cheap cards highly, value the more expensive cards a little bit lower. Something I want to touch on, and this is something that I've said before, and I think a lot of people I've said about Cube is just like all the cards are good, right? And I want to kind of challenge that a little bit, and not to say that I don't think it's the cards aren't all good, because in the grand scheme of Magic, all the cards in the cube, I mean, except for like, Teferi's Protection or whatever weird things in there that I don't know why they're in there. I don't know. There's some odd ones in there. Most of them are just good Magic cards, right? That doesn't mean that you can't go wrong, though. It doesn't mean that that you can't just take the bad cards still. And what I'm trying to say here is there is still a tier list, right? And it's really important to understand what the top tier cards are, what the second tier cards are, what the third tier cards are. It's just like normal limited. It's just the scales are shifted up where everything gets boosted. The worst cards are like what some of the better cards you'd see in normal limited. Where the best of the best cards are stuff like Lorehold Command and Hallbreaker Horror and Sublime Epiphany, like the actual A+ bombs of limited. This is one of the challenging things to get right when you're making the transition is identifying what is no longer a great card and merely an okay card. And it takes some practice, it takes some reps, or it could just take asking somebody that knows better, in a Discord or on Twitter or whatever. Maybe it's hard to go over the entire cube, but asking like, hey, is this card actually like much better than is this card better than I think it is, or is it worse than I think it is something to think about. Okay, so let's dive into Arena Cube specifics. So the way I want to approach this is go by colors. I think that normally when I do a deep dive on a archetype, on a format, I go archetype to archetype. I just talk about them briefly. And when I say archetype, I mean 2-color pair and kind of what those 2-color pairs are doing. It's not really like that in this cube. Like the 2-color pairs, there's some synergy. Like black-red sacrifice is kind of a deck, and there's some, interwoven synergies, but it's not really like, oh, you're blue-green, you're doing this, right? It's much more about big picture, broad synergies. And I think they did a pretty good job of like, if I'm trying to label those big picture, broad synergies, I can kind of just go color by color and tell you what those colors are doing. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And as we're doing that, I want to just kind of highlight some of the better cards in those colors. One of the things that people requested when I was, asking what people wanted to hear about for this episode was kind of like the tier 1 cards in the cube. And I'm going to try to touch on that. Maybe not going to touch on all of them, but it's one of my goals for going over the colors here. So let's talk about red first. Red is doing red things. It's probably the most simple color. The vast majority of its cards are being burny, they're aggressive. You know, there's a lot of cheap 1 and 2 aggressive creatures that you look at the cards and you're like, I just know what these do, right? And I do think mono red is, or you know, at least close to mono red, is one of the better decks in the cube. That's another thing I want to touch on, is just like, this is where I'm going to talk about kind of like archetype rankings and stuff like that. I've had a lot of success with red decks in the cube. I know the previous iteration of the cube, mono red, outperformed the other decks by a lot. Things have changed a little bit. I don't think so much that they are, you know, this deck is way worse or anything. I don't have the exact numbers, but I think from what I've seen and the fact there has not been that many changes to the cube, I would assume, and you know, this is my experience has been, red aggro is still quite good. It can be, and often is, with a slight splash. If you're so lucky as to be the only red drafter or one of the only red drafters, you can be mono red, and that's ideal to have just a clean mana base. But the problem is that, one, I think because mono red has been so good over the past few iterations, people have caught on. And so you don't just, like, I remember it was completely uncontested at some point when people are just like, oh, I'm just going to draft my green ramp deck. You know, people are happy with that. Now people have caught on. And like Scorched Spitter doesn't wheel anymore. Or like the stupid 1-drop sometimes don't wheel, you know. That being said, it's still a great place to be. And if I can be in it, I will. What that means, though, is you have to be kind of vigilant about if it's actually open, and if you need to pair it. Like, if you start in red with a lot of good red cards, you might have to pair it with a secondary color, and what that often means is speculating on dual lands so you can do that. So let's just go over some of the better red cards. I've got Lightning Bolt. We already went over that. I've got Magda. Really great card. So just to talk a little bit about Magda, because I think maybe that's a little bit of an odd one to some people. This is a great aggressive card because it's a, you know, attacks for 2, which is fine, and then ramps you to 4. Play your double spell on turn 3 or play a 4-drop. That's awesome. Often this just dies, but you know, that's gonna happen. The card's awesome anyways. It's, you know, people are gonna want to kill it. And then even in your like more controlling decks, it's a fine card too, because if it just gets an attack and makes you treasure and then trades, pretty darn good. Or it just like trades off with their 2-drop. So this is a card that I'm happy with in either like a slower red deck or a more aggressive deck. Oh, one more thing I want to mention actually is that I'm mostly going to talk, when I'm talking about these like top cards, I'm mostly going to touch on flexible cards. So I think that one of the things is all of the colors, like red and white included, can be drafted both ways, like aggressive or controlling. Now, red and white are going to be more often aggressive. Blue is more often going to be controlling, but you can draft them both ways sometimes. A lot of these cards I'm going to touch on as the best cards in the cube are going to be cards that are great in both those, both the aggressive and maybe the slower decks. And Magda and Lightning Bolt are great. The next one, Bone Crusher Giant. Again, fantastic both ways. It's great in your aggressive decks, great in your controlling decks. Chandra Torch of Defiance, 4-mana Planeswalker. One of the better 4-drops in the cube. I was saying you cannot load up on the expensive cards, but this is one of the ones that I'm pretty into, you know, taking early and being one of my more expensive cards. Going up the curve a little bit here, we have Sarkhan the Masterless. I want to shout this one out as, I don't know if it's a new edition. I don't actually remember playing with this card before, but I've been really, really impressed with it. This is a 5-mana Planeswalker, 5 loyalty. When it has a static ability, whenever a creature attacks you or a Planeswalker you control, it deals 1 damage to that creature. +1, it becomes a 4/4, or all your Planeswalkers become 4/4 dragons, not with haste, so this can't attack immediately. And -3 as you make a 4/4 dragon. I don't think it's like, you know, top tier by any means, but again, this is kind of in the Chandra tier of, I like this card as one of my expensive cards. There's Glorybringer, 4/4 haste, you know, most people know what Glorybringer is. Giant dragon, kills things. And then there's Embercleave. You know, Embercleave, the quintessential mono red aggro card. One of the better cards for the aggro decks, just in general. Doesn't really play both ways. Doesn't really do that. You know, you can't really play this in your controlling deck, but it's still really good in your, you know, fantastic in your aggro decks. I want to reiterate that in your mono red aggro decks, you want to not play the damage spells that don't go to face. Those are liabilities sometimes. I also want to talk about the X spells. So like Devil's Play and Banefire. These aren't the worst cards in the world, but they're not cards I want to play. I think a lot of people look at these cards and are like, ooh, that's pretty good reach. Like, you know, I put my opponent to 7 and then I burn them out with an X spell. And it's easy to imagine that situation, but too often they're just like inefficient burn spells. And a lot of the cards these days, like the mono red aggro cards, just have like reach built into them. They like flash back as like creatures, or they're just you know, they're just decent things that generate value, you know, when they die, like an annex or something like that. So Devil's Play is like, you know, Devil's Play, Banefire. These are cards I'm not trying to play. They're just too efficient too early, essentially. Chandra Awakened Inferno is another big planeswalker, 6-mana planeswalker. This is kind of, so with this card, it's kind of a stand-in for any expensive red card. Depending on how much interaction you end up with versus how many creatures you end up with, you kind of want to balance how many expensive cards you have. And what I mean by that is, if you have a lot of cheap cards in your deck, like, sorry, a lot of cheap creatures, like say you're in the 15, 16, 17 cheap creature range, you don't really want a lot of expensive cards. Like, I'm going to maybe not play that Sarkhan, maybe play another 1-drop instead. Because you're planning to win the game with your cheap things, not with your expensive things. But if you happen to end up in a place where you end up with like only like 11 creatures or something and more interaction, that's going to push me more towards playing expensive things, maybe like a Chandra, a Sarkhan, something that's a bit more grindy, mid-rangey, because I'm not going to consistently be able to curve out 1, 2, 3. I'm going to be stuck with some removal spells sometimes, even if they do go to face, meaning the game's going to go a little bit longer. I'm not just going to kill them every time early, so I need to have a bit more power in there. Basically, I'm willing to sacrifice explosiveness for power because I won't always have that explosiveness, right? So when you have a lot of early creatures, you do have that high creature count. Don't worry about some beefy things up top. If you don't end up with all the ones in the 2s, if you do end up with all the ones in the 2s, don't play the, you know, I would bias away playing the more expensive things, essentially. Which is one of those things that comes up. It's like, do I play my great card, or am I low enough to the ground that I don't want to play it? When you're drafting mono red aggro, I speculate on dual lands quite a bit, like Blood Crypt, Sacred Foundry, Black's an okay splash sometimes for like Judith and Mayhem Devil, those kind of cards. Sacred Foundry, white is a common splash too. Like I was saying before, you can't always be monocolored. Often you're going to have to splash a second color, and the worst scenario you can be in with an aggro deck is have a mana base where you're split down the middle, like half white cards, half red cards, and no dual lands. Ideally, you're not, like, I see a lot of people building like Boros aggro decks. Even when you have dual lands there, I wouldn't suggest that, because your aggro deck is just so much better being close to monocolored than not. If you want to splash a few powerful cards, Lorehold Command, Timely Reinforcement, not Timely Reinforcements, Heroic Reinforcements, sorry, totally fine. But really try to, when you're drafting these decks, mono red, but also mono white, try your best to stick close to one color. And have your secondary color that you likely will have to have, a few cards of as your actual secondary color. Oh, the other thing too is, this goes back to mana a little bit, but really, really be careful about those double pipped cards. Like I was saying, like trying to play a Sarah the Benevolent, which is a white planeswalker in your mono red deck that's like splashing some white cards, is really tough. Gonna be really, really tough on your mana. Like, you're just gonna lose to your bad mana a lot of the time. So really try to keep it, close to that, that one color, or if you can pick up a bunch of duels, that's ideal. If you are like mono red with 5 white cards, you still want like 6 or 7 duels if you can, especially the ones that come in untapped. I really just want to stress how important it is to have good mana, essentially. Okay, so that's red. Sorry, just one last thing I want to say about red is it's a pretty good color for the just like as a supplementary color for the control decks. Like if you're like a blue control deck, there's a lot of good removal spells that are cheap, hit the early creatures. The Thundering Rebuke, it's kind of swapped, right? In my controlling decks, I don't want the Royal Eruption as much as I want the Thundering Rebuke. I want the thing that kills more things rather than the thing that goes to face, essentially. Chat's addressing something, or chat's pointing out something I want to address just quickly about the red decks too, is that, people have said, I felt that the aggro decks are a little bit tougher to they don't get free wins as easily anymore because the other decks are kind of, there's more sweepers, and the other decks are more prepared with life gain and just good things along the curve. I agree you don't get free wins, and a Wrath can like sometimes be a problem, but XRS is pointing out in chat here, and I totally agree that the red decks also have a lot of really good ways to grind and be resilient. Annex, which is the 3 mana power equal to your devotion to red, and when a creature you control dies, you make a 1/1. Phoenix of Ash, Rekindling Phoenix, Axe of Agonis, all really good against removal spells, and they're just like fine cards you would play in your mono red deck. So it's not like a white aggro deck where that sometimes just folds to a Wrath if you don't have the right cards. A lot of the red cards are pretty resilient, and you know if you get Wrath, sure, you have burn spells too, right? Those help close the game. There's also planeswalkers as well, right? Like the Chandra I was talking about. There's the 3 mana Chandra, which is pretty good too. So that's another way to be resilient against the aggressive decks. Okay, let's move on to white. So white is kind of split. It does the aggressive thing pretty well. As yeah, it's kind of like an analog to red. There's a lot of good 1-drops. A lot of good 2 and 3 drops, especially 3 drops. There's a lot of good aggressive 3 drops, which, you know, you of course have to be careful not to load up on too many of those. I think it's not as good of an aggressive deck, just because. So what white kind of adds to an aggressive deck, or what it offers over a red aggressive deck, is some form of resilience, right? Like often it has things that can make your things indestructible or equipment, and that's all fine and dandy. But red kind of does that as well. And I think, you know, white not having burn spells is kind of rough. Not to say that it's not a good aggro deck. I think mono white can be pretty good still. I just don't think it's as good if you were to hand me a white deck or a red deck, I would choose the red deck. But let's talk about some white cards. So Luminarch Aspirant, which is one of the nerfed cards actually from Alchemy, is still a pretty good 2-drop. So this is the 2 mana 1/1. When it used to be at the beginning of combat, you put a counter on a creature. Now it's on the end step. It's worse, but I still think it's pretty decent. Swords to Plowshares, again, just like premium card. I'll still play this in my aggressive deck for sure. Like, it gains my opponent life, but you know what? Getting that 5-drop out of the way for 1 mana is definitely worth it. Sternheim Unleashed, still a really great card in your controlling or your aggressive decks. And Restoration Angel is another one. It's pretty good in both kind of decks, which is 3 and a white for a 3/4 flash flyer. When ATBs, you can blink one of your non-angels. I think that all of these cards play pretty well both ways, except Luminarch Aspirant doesn't really play well in the control deck, but the other ones do. Again, these are like kind of the top cards that I'd highlight for the color. And then it's kind of got just like a bunch of good aggressive cards. Like all the 1-drops are all fine. Like there's nothing I can point to and be like, that's the 1-drop of choice, you know, that's the 2-drop of choice. I mean, I'm sure I could, but nothing that's like super sticking out to me as like, oh man, this is like key for these decks, right? Like if you've seen it in a constructed deck, it's probably pretty good. It is maybe one of the baselines I can give to you, right? And just white in general, I was saying it kind of is split a little bit. It's kind of got a lot of controlling cards, more controlling cards than red, for sure. And that's not a bad thing, right? It just means that like you have to be careful if somebody else is in the same lane as you. Don't go down the deep white aggro path if you notice the white aggro cards aren't wheeling. And, you know, white does a pretty good job of supplementing blue as well. Just like it's got some decent cheap removal. It's got some Wraths. It's got a few decent gold cards. So I don't have much to say about white, honestly. I think it's decent. I'm not as enthusiastic about it as red. But there's a few people in chat that are saying they feel the opposite. People I definitely trust and respect, like NCAA. So, you know, take my opinion with a grain of salt. That's just my my take on white. It's everything I said about red. The red aggro decks can kind of apply to white. I'm sure there's a lot of nuance I'm glossing over here. But for a big picture take, that's what I got to give to you for white, essentially. Okay, let's talk about blue. Blue is my favorite. I don't actually think I know if it's the best color in the cube. I think that probably goes to red still. But blue has got some really, really nice stuff. So I was warning against drafting expensive cards earlier. And while I think that is still in effect here, blue's got some really, really, really great expensive cards. It's got Hullbreaker Horror, which is just, I think, you know, we're going to look back in 10 years of Hullbreaker Horror and be like, yeah, that's just like an all-timer. Like, I every time I've played with this card, in every context, it's been amazing. Like this cube, vintage cube even, I just think this card is fantastic. It is, it has replaced Sublime Epiphany for me as the best blue card in the cube. Or best expensive blue card in the cube, I should say. Sublime Epiphany is another one that's also still really, really good, so I don't want to down talk that. But both these cards are awesome and a good reason to draft the blue control deck. The difference between taking these really powerful, expensive blue cards and taking expensive cards in another color is that blue is often set up to play the long game and take advantage of these, right? Whereas like some other colors, that's not true. I don't think black plays as well of a long game. I don't think red or white plays as well of a long game. They can, but blue plays the long game really well because it's got counter spells and card draw and all that kind of good stuff. So those are the big two. We move down a little bit to Discover the Formula, which is also really, really good. So this is an alchemy card. I'm sure a lot of you haven't played with it. It's 4 blue for an instant. You seek 3 non-land cards. Okay, so what seek means is basically if I looked through my deck and separated all the lands from the spells, I put the spells in one pile, I put the lands in another pile, right? I drew 3 cards randomly from the spell pile. So you basically get 3 spells from your deck. And then it says the cards in your hand perpetually gain this spell costs 1 less to cast. So it makes everything in your hand cheaper, which is kind of cool because you're not drawing lands with this card, which sometimes you want to draw with your draw spell. It doesn't matter. All the things are cheaper in your hand. That's better than drawing lands, right? Oh yes, small point. This does not shuffle your deck for anything that cares about that. So if you have brainstormed, this will not clear the top of your deck for brainstorm. It just seeks it. It doesn't actually shuffle. So basically this draws you 3 good spells and they're cheaper as well. Not as good as a finisher as these other 2 cards, but it is close. And I actually could see this being, as I play with the more usurping Sublime Epiphany as the big 6 mana spell. I know Sublime Epiphany does some busted stuff, but until you've played with Discover, I don't think you can like truly grasp just how good it feels to have like a grip full of spells, and they're all so much cheaper than they normally are. So this card's awesome. Next tier down, you got like Shark Typhoon, which is really good. Torrential Gearhulk, great card. And then once you've got your reasons to draft blue, which are those big cards, prioritize the counter spells, especially the 2 mana ones. Counterspell is in this cube. Actual counterspell, blue, counter target spell. Censor, it's quite good. Memory Lapse, another really good card. Memory Lapse is one that I think people are kind of like, oh, why do I want that? Which is, it's 1 in a blue, counter target spell. You put it on top of the library instead of counter it. It just buys you a turn, right? It's not going to deal with something for good, but like putting their 4-drop on top is still really good. They have to redraw it. They have to recast it. It's kind of a tempo-y spell, but that's okay. Like, okay, so when you're just trying to get to 6 or 7 mana to cast those awesome things, right? Time walking your opponent essentially on turn 4 is really, really good. So this card is much better than it reads if you're not used to playing with this card. All the 2 mana counters, like, there's a bunch of 2 mana and 3 mana counters. Well, there's fewer 2 mana counters, but the 2 mana counters are really important, both because they're good on the draw, which sometimes the 3 mana counters can be awkward, but also just like 2 mana. Again, going back to mana is not linear. 2 mana is just so much less than 3 mana. So there's that. There's also like the 3 mana counters, which you'll play too. But once I have the expensive things, I just want to like, the expensive finishers, I just want to load up on counter spells and card draw, and then supplement that with removal spells from whatever your secondary color is, or wraths from your secondary color. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Classic blue control. 2 cards I want to point out that are not maybe on some people's radar. Actually, one that is, I think, and one that isn't as much. Mythos of Aluna. This one got some hype last go around. It's 2 blue, 4 mana. You make a token of any permanent, and then if you spend green and red, that permanent fights, which is like, comes up sometimes, and that's awesome when it does. If you have the mana in your deck off a dual land or a triome, great, but don't force too hard to make that work. The 2 blue, make a copy of anything is just really powerful. Copy a Planeswalker, copy a Hullbreaker, your own Hullbreaker even, copy a land if you need to. I've done that before. Just one of blue's, like, not quite Planeswalker-y cards, but kind of that level. And the other one that I do want to shout out as, I think, probably underrated is Hard Evidence. Especially if you have not drafted Modern Horizons 2, this card probably does not look like a card that is all that impressive. So this is a single blue mana for a sorcery. Create an 0/3 blue crab token and investigate, which, make a clue token. So you make a clue and you make a crab all for 1 mana. Great deal. It's essentially a removal spell for their early stuff, right? Against their 1-drops and their 2-drops. And against control, it just cycles. And sometimes you have like a use for the body. You can like sacrifice it or something like that. Really just like efficient card. Walls the early stuff. And yeah, sometimes you have use for the body in the late game. So really, really great. Let's move on to green. So the blue, green, and white, or sorry, blue, white, and red, I believe are the best colors in the cube. Now we move on to green and black. Green got a buff just because it added some like powerful cards in general. I think green is still a little bit awkward. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I like it better than I did last time. What green does the best is it ramps. It offers you cheap accelerants, namely Llanowar Elves, Gilded Goose, and just Spear Sentinel, if your deck can support that. Not all your decks can support it, but if you have a high enough creature count, cheap creatures, it's great. Also very good with Magda. If you have not lived the dream back in Call Time with just Spear Sentinel plus Magda, that's a great combo. Magda does not say when she attacks you make a treasure. She says when she's tapped. So you can start really going off, making a lot of mana. So that's a kind of cute little combo. But yeah, what green offers is the cheap ramp, cheap accelerants. That's kind of what it always offers in Cube. That's the best thing it can do. It's got a wide, list, a long list of expensive, beefy things that it can cast. They're mostly interchangeable. Your 1 4 mana or 5 mana card is not that much different from your next 6 or 7 mana card. Like, they're all big things that you can ramp into. They're all kind of interchangeable. But these 1 mana accelerants are super, super important because there's not a lot of them. So these three, like I was saying, Gilded Goose, Elves, and Sentinel, just Spear Sentinel, they're the only 1 mana accelerants. And the 1 mana accelerants are just a lot better than the 2 or 3 ones. Because they're 1 mana. But you've also got 2 mana accelerants as well, and 3 mana ones, and like Cultivate. I would shy away from the 3 mana accelerants generally. Those are where you're getting to a bit clunky. Like, Cultivate's good because it provides card advantage, and there's a few other ones that are like card advantage-y. Yeah, the cheaper the better you can get. So I was saying the big fatties are kind of interchangeable. I think it's mostly true, but I do want to shout out a few of them that I think are kind of standouts. Asika's Chariot has been nerfed. The new text of Asika's Chariot is it has crew 2 and only makes 1 cat. But that is still okay. It's still pretty good. It's not as busted, but still a fine 4-drop. Elder Gargoth, big ol' 6/6 Vigilance Trample Reach. Has a bunch of abilities when you attack or block with it. Quite good. Really good at stabilizing versus aggro. This is actually probably like one of the cards that red aggressive decks don't want to see the most. Because it comes down... It's giants. They just can't kill it unless they have multiple burn spells, and it gains life and makes creatures. It's really, really good against the aggressive decks. Renin 7, a good planeswalker. Vivian Reed's another pretty good planeswalker. Great Henge, 7 mana artifact, 9 mana artifact, but it gets reduced based on a big creature you have to play. If you have a 7-drop in play, 7 power creature in play, it'll cost 7 less. 6 power creature in play, costs 6 less. Yada yada yada. Tap it, add 2 green to your mana pool, you gain 2 life, and then whenever a non-token creature enters, you draw a card and put a counter on it. So these are some of green's better cards. Like I said, I think most of the green big dummy things are pretty interchangeable. Like a good example is like Tovolar's Huntmaster, right? Like that's obviously a busted card in mid-limited, but it's just like, yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good in Cube. It's not like, I would say these cards are better than Tovolar's Huntmaster. These are in a tier above. I want to give a quick shout out to Wilderness Reclamation. Shout outs to NCAA, who is a member of multiple limited discords and now streamer himself, has been hyping up this card. So I have to give it some credence here. So Wilderness Reclamation, for those who don't know, is 3 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you untap all lands you control. In previous iterations, this card was pretty powerful. It's not really a green card. It's a blue card for the most part because you want to play it with instants, right? I can envision decks where you're like base green and you play it with like not blue cards, but it's the baseline is you're playing this in a blue control deck, either like blue green or you're splashing it off of like a few dual lands or something. But this thing's kind of absurd when you just have your deck when your deck's full of instants. Like it just doubles your mana. And it's very, very powerful. So this is more of a niche thing to do, but it's awesome, and it's really fun, and it's really powerful. So be on the lookout for it, especially because it's a card that goes late. You can often wheel it unless there's like another person in the know at the table. Okay, the Problem Child. Let's move on to black. So black in this cube has kind of suffered a bit of power creep, where, like I was saying, the cube has gotten more powerful as the years have gone on, or the months have gone on, whatever. I think this cube's probably been out for 2 years at this point. And a lot of what black was doing was like grindy nickel and dime value stuff with like sacrifice, and like it was doing some like blood RDC kind of stuff. And not to say that that stuff can't work, but I think most of the black cards, like if you just go through the card list, a lot of them are pretty junky. Like they're those, removal spells, which I noted before are fine, but then a lot of it's just like just underrated stuff, essentially stuff you don't want to touch. I think if you were the only black drafter at the table, I think you could actually have a pretty good deck. But the general arena population has historically been drawn to black cards because black cards are appealing, right? So removal spells are appealing. So I don't think this set is going to be out long enough, and especially during the Decathlon, that things will even out where people realize, oh, black's not so good. Where it will be valued appropriately to where you can get an awesome black deck. That being said, it's not undraftable by any means. Like I was saying, the delta between the good cards and the bad cards is not giant, but if I am to start somewhere, it's not black. I do want to shout out the two actual like tier 1 cards in black. I think there are 2 of them. They are Lolth, Spider Queen, and Meat Hook Massacre. Both these cards are awesome. Both in the like aggressive decks or controlling decks. They're both good. Like Meat Hook's good in an aggressive aristocratic deck too, because you deal a lot of damage with it. These are like the true tier 1 cards. There's a few like tier 2 ones that we can get to. But if I see these late, I might speculate on them. Black's also pretty good at supporting like blue control. Like again, you can just be like a blue-black control deck. It's okay at supporting red. Like I said, there's a few decent red like red-black sacrifice cards, but then again, you have to be careful of your mana base, so proceed with caution. Some of the best black cards for that strategy are double black, so that can cause some problems, so just be careful about that. Next tier down, we've got Rankle, which is a good card, but not quite on the level of the other two, but it's right up there. Demonic Tutor is an interesting one, because I think it is good but overrated. I think a lot of people view Demonic Tutor as like this like holy grail that can never be touched, an awesome card, always like equivalent to almost the power 9. Demonic Tutor's power is largely based on what you can get with it, and also the power of the format in general. Like a Demonic Tutor in Vintage Cube is much better than a Demonic Tutor in this cube, and a Demonic Tutor in Strixhaven Limited is much worse than a Demonic Tutor in this format, right? So, like, not to say that this isn't a card you should include in your black decks. It's just you shouldn't, like, first pick this. Because spending 2 mana to get your best card, while good, is still a tempo hit. So be careful about that. I like Thoughtseize. Just 1 mana, hand disruption. Is historically good in cubes. Just being able to disrupt your opponents, what they're doing. Even against an aggressive deck, you lose 2 life. But being able to take the early play is pretty good. Or being able to take that, like, Planeswalker you can't deal with. Not like tippity top tier, but is one of the standout cards for me for black. Then if you are doing the black sacrifice stuff, there's quite a few good cards, but the ones I want to point out are new edition Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. This is 2 black for a 2/4. A lot of text. Buckle in, folks. Actually, not that much, but it's a decent amount of text. So protection from humans. Okay, cool. Can't be Brutal Cathard, notably. Pay 1 life, sacrifice a creature, put a -1/-1 counter on up to target creature, draw a card, and black, discard a card, proliferate. So, does some really cool stuff, like can throw around a bunch of sacrifice fodder to kill your opponent's board, draw some cards. Really nice engine card. Blood Artist, another one in a black for a 0/1 when it dies, or when anything dies on your side. Sorry, when anything dies at all. Target player loses life, you gain life. Again, really good thing for the black sacrifice deck if you happen to be there. And Priest of the Forgotten Gods, 1 in a black for a 1/2. Sacrifice 2 other creatures, tap this, and then any number of players loses 2 life, sacrifice the creature, then you gain black mana and you draw a card. So, yeah, I mean, these are the standout cards for the sacrifice deck if you end up there. But again, I think that deck is generally underpowered unless you like end up with like the nuts version of it, essentially. And then the final archetype I want to touch on here is just like multicolor good stuff. If you are predisposed to taking or to drafting multicolor good stuff, which is like 4 to 5 color good stuff, nothing wrong with taking, like I was saying, where do you want to prioritize lands? And I was saying you generally don't want to first pick them. But if you know you are somebody who likes to draft these decks, prioritize triomes, prioritize dual lands, and then just take all the powerful cards that come to you. I do want to touch on, this is a good time to probably touch on Golos Field of the Dead, where in previous iterations of the cube, I think it was one of the best things to do. I think it has been power crept a little bit. Not to say it's a bad thing to do. I think it's just more like a fine incidental thing to do. Like a good, little synergy package for your multicolor deck, but it's not going to be like the most powerful thing your opponent you can do. You're not going to always outpower your opponent. Like I believe somebody casting Hullbreaker Horror or Solve the Formula or whatever that card's called, the 6 mana draw spell, seek some cards, or Sublime Epiphany is doing more powerful stuff than Golos Field of the Dead. You just get outclassed a little bit by that kind of stuff. Again, it's going to be really good still, or good, I would say still good, but not like first pick Field of the Dead. As far as winning goes, right? If that's something you like to do, great. I just don't think you should first pick Golos anymore. Field of the Dead is a little bit different because you can kind of just throw that into a lot of decks that have a lot of dual lands and it'll just be a good card. But Golos specifically, that is like good, but it requires some work, essentially. And then I just wanted to move on to some notable cards that I didn't really get to. Key to the Archive is kind of a banger, kind of another alchemy card. So this is a 4 mana artifact, comes in tapped. It adds 2 mana of any color, or taps to add 2 mana of any color. So it's a mana rock. And when it enters the battlefield, you draft a card from the Key to the Archive spellbook and then discard a card. What this card, the spellbook of Key to the Archive is a lot of the Strixhaven. What are they called? Archive cards? Yeah, the special cards. Like Approach of the Second Sun, Demonic Tutor, Time Warp, Putrefy, Electrolyze, all those kind of awesome cards. There's some stinkers in there too. There's like Croson Grimp and like what's it called? Claim the Firstborn. But for those who haven't seen this drafting mechanic, right? It's basically there's like a list of cards that if a card says draft a card from this card's archive, this card's spellbook. That card has a list of like 10 cards or 15 cards associated with it, and the game will show you 3 of them at random, right? And you get to pick one of them. So I play Key of the Archive. The game shows me Time Warp, Approach to the Second Sun, and Claim the Firstborn. I get to draft one of those and put it in my hand. You have to discard a card. That's part of the thing. You don't just, it's not just free card advantage, but you get to access to a very powerful card. This card is, I believe, one of the better new additions. Not for aggro decks, definitely, but in any deck that's trying to cast expensive stuff, or even like a mid-range deck, really, really powerful. If you're trying to ramp to like one of those expensive blue cards, great card, right? Just like one of the best ones you can possibly have. Next one I want to shout out is Cold Steelheart, which is 2 mana artifact. Comes in tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, and it taps for any mana. It taps for that color. 2 mana mana rock, essentially. These 2 mana mana rocks are generally pretty good in cube formats. Like again, if you're like being a mid-range or controlling deck, not really an aggressive card. You don't want this in your aggressive deck, but casting a 4-drop or a 5-drop turn early, quite powerful. Really good in those like blue controlling decks. Yeah, a pretty high pick if you're there. And then the last 2 cards I want to shout out are Lorehold's Command and Kolaghan's Command. I think that not all of the commands are in the cube, but like 5 of them are maybe, and these are the 2 I want to shout out as I believe the best ones. Lorehold Command being the best one. Great card in like, one of the better splash cards in a white aggro deck or a red aggro deck. Great in like a Jeskai control deck or something like that. Like this is it just does so much, right? It just does so much for the amount of mana you're paying. You can bolt something, gain 3, make a blocker. A lot of times, even in my control decks, I've just gone make a 3/2, haste my I actually got wins off of hasting my crabs out from Hard Evidence with Lorehold Command and like a Jeskai control deck I had. So like no matter which way you slice it, there's gonna be something awesome to do with Lorehold Command, and yeah, just one of the best cards in the cube. Kolaghan's Command is also awesome. This one goes a little bit further back. I feel like this card was just printed yesterday, but that just is me being a Magic Boomer at this point, I suppose. So this is 1 black-red, instant, choose 2. You either return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, you target player discards a card, destroy an artifact, or you deal 2 to anything. It's like a mini Lorehold command. Not quite, they don't have the same effects, but you get the same feeling of like, oh wow, I can do so many good things here. Like, blow up an artifact, kill a 2 toughness creature. Great. Get that last card out of your opponent's hand, rebuy your awesome creature. Great. Right? Really, really awesome card. I've splashed this card in my control decks, like my black-blue control decks as well. Yeah, great card. Okay, just closing out our podcast here. I just want to give a quick note on draft navigation, because this is something that people have come to me as again, something they wanted some words on. So I don't think I have time to go I could do a whole nother podcast on draft navigation, but generally I don't navigate drafts of Cube all that differently from how you would navigate a normal draft. I think when people have a tough time navigating a Cube draft compared to a normal draft, it's more because of a trouble evaluating the cards, or not being kind of up to speed on which of the tier 1 cards are and the tier 2 cards, because they're all good. They all look good, right? But if you kind of distill, maybe based on some of the things I've said today, or, again, if you reach out to other people, what those actual good cards are, it's not that much different. And generally, my draft navigation, just like it would be for any draft format, is you take the best card in the pack with adjusted for biases, right? If you want to be red aggro, or you don't always have to take that Hullbreaker Horror. You could take the Lightning Bolt, like I was saying, and you stay flexible, right? Stay close to one color. Staying close to one color is awesome, both because mana is a big concern, right? Really, really big concern, and you want to not be all over the place unless you have a billion dual hands. But also the flexibility of starting blue and then going, okay, I've taken good blue card, good blue card, good blue card, good blue card. Now I can take a land, maybe speculate on being blue-black, or take a removal spell, speculate on being blue-red, or take a Magma Opus, speculate on a good finisher for blue-red. It's very similar. You're just get deep into one color early, take the best card, here's the steps, right? Take the best cards early, which requires some prior knowledge of knowing what that is, and then get deep into a color if you can, or pivot if you realize that color's not open, right? And that's part of staying flexible too, because you could, even if you realize your color's not open, maybe you get to play your awesome blue card you first picked in your deep, white deck or whatever it is. You realize white's really open, great, you move in there. Maybe a bit of a snag is where to take lands, and I think that is something that also trips some people up. When in doubt, take the land, honestly. Unless it's a top tier card, like one of those tier 1 cards I was talking about that I mentioned, just take the land. Especially if you're already that color combination. But even if you're I have a 50% chance of being blue-red, take the blue-red land over the decent counterspell or whatever. I am really, really, I've said this a bunch of times. I just can't say it enough. It's really bad to have bad mana. And bad mana is it doesn't take that much to have bad mana, I guess is the way I'd put it. If I end up with 3 dual lands, that's not cutting it sometimes, right? Another thing you can consider is if you take lands early, you could end up with just a bunch of lands and being in a 3-color deck where you're Jeskai Control or Grixis Control or something like that, right? Where you don't need to be the most open color pair. You can just be okay, I position myself to play all my good cards, right? And that sometimes happens. I wouldn't. So when I was drafting on stream yesterday, people were kind of surprised that I went awesome blue card into awesome red card into awesome green card into awesome white card. I think there's this idea that when you're drafting Cube, you want to draft a super synergistic deck. You pick a awesome card first pick and you build around that. Just, that's what Cube is about, getting deep into a draft. And while that's true, you want to end up there. The process for getting there is still draft like you would normally draft. You know what I mean? Stay open and kind of don't lock in too early. So those are just some thoughts about draft navigation. The one last thing I want to touch on, because it is important, because the Arena Decathlon is best of 3, is sideboarding. So of course this starts with draft, right? You can't sideboard if you don't have any sideboard cards. But just like I would say, take a land over a medium playable or a fine playable, think about sideboard cards, right? Think about, you don't really have the traditional plummet sideboard cards, but think about what your deck might be weak against. So to give 2 examples, if you are a controlling deck and you think you're kind of poorly positioned against the mono red aggro deck, pick up some like crappy creatures at the end of the pack, right? It doesn't have to be like, silver bullet against aggro. There's no like timely reinforcements that like completely kills aggro decks. I mean, there are a few cards that are very good against aggro, but you're probably gonna have those in your main deck anyways. But like siding in some like 2/2s with marginal effects is generally a pretty effective way to sideboard against an aggressive deck as a controlling deck, and you get a lot of those cards for free. If you are an aggro deck, the way you often want to sideboard is considering, like, if your opponent has a lot of interaction, your plan of 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop kill you will not work very often, because your opponent's just going to have enough removal often to like stymie that aggressive plan. So you often want to board up a little bit, and maybe you have like a Showdown of the Skulls in your sideboard, or a Starnheim Unleashed that you went, okay, I was super low to the ground, I don't want to play this card. Maybe you would always play Starnheim. Maybe that's not the best example, but one of those more expensive cards that I was kind of saying be hesitant about those. Bring those in, because if your opponent's got a bunch of spot removal, right? Your opponent's got a bunch of spot removal, then your value cards like Starnheim Unleashed or Showdown of the Skulls can really, really punish that. So often when I'm an aggressive deck, I can find a way to punish what my opponent is doing. They either are going big and have value cards, and my deck naturally punishes that because I have a bunch of 1s and 2s and 3s, or they have spot removal, and I can punish that by bringing in those bigger cards, Sometimes I side out of my 1-drops altogether if I have enough sideboard cards, right? I'm just like, oh cool, like they've got a lot of cheap creatures and cheap removal. My 1-drops aren't going to do anything. So let me bring in, like, let me just side up really big, just shift the curve up a little bit, right? You can really go as far as that. I think in general, control decks have a bit more to gain, or are able to sideboard a bit easier, because you can like often react to exactly what your opponent's doing a bit easier. Whereas like as the aggressive deck, it's kind of, they always say there's no wrong answers. But there's always, you can't have wrong answers. You can't have wrong questions, only wrong answers, kind of alluding to the fact that, control decks can kind of have wrong answers versus specific types of aggro cards. I actually don't buy that very much. I think you can definitely have wrong questions to ask for your removal deck, right? You can definitely have wrong threats that don't line up with what your opponent's doing. So if you have a bunch of cheap creatures, like the 1s and the 2s, you kind of want to sideboard those out a lot of the time if your opponent has good ways to interact early. And then just think of like I wouldn't say transformational sideboards work that often, but sometimes they do if you happen to pick up the cards in the draft. But just those like slightly positionally shifting yourself away from, X1s, if they have, a lot of X1 hate isn't really the right term, but if your creatures in the board line up slightly better against the creatures that your opponent has, that kind of stuff, right? And I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. We're gonna move to chat Q&A. Before we do that, just again want to thank everybody for hanging out. Like I said before, this will be up on the podcast feed as always, and the YouTube for anybody who wants the visuals. But chat, I'm going to send it to you. For once, I did a good job of not destroying my voice, so I actually have a bit of voice in me to, to answer chat. Oh, also, just one more thing I wanted to say, if for those who stuck to the end here. New year, new limited level ups. I just want to say that I really, really appreciate all the support in 2021. We saw a lot of growth. Obviously hoping to see, more people join the limited level ups community, and get on that podcast bandwagon. And as part of a thank you to everybody supporting, I just want to say I'm trying to make a commitment to solid one episode a week. For the past year, it's been like once every 2, sometimes one episode a week during, on seasons when a new set came out. But I'm going to try my very best to pump that content out once a week. And yeah. Okay, first question. How do you effectively pilot out of monocolored aggro decks when it's clear they aren't open? Great question. So often when you start down the monocolored aggro path, you've got a lot of cards that don't play the other way. Like, if everybody in the draft is trying to draft aggro, it's very hard to go, my aggro cards, somebody's drafting, other people are drafting aggro, let me try to play these cards I've drafted before, like, early in the draft in my, like, mid-range or control deck. It doesn't really work like that very well. So that's number one. That's why I really advise prioritizing the flexible cards. Even if you have a predisposition to drafting controlling or aggressive decks, I would really prioritize, to go to back to red, Chandra, Magda, Lightning Bolt, Bone Crusher. These cards that play well in both strategies above all else, right? This actually brings up another point. Even if you do want to draft monocolor aggro, like, it's still probably important to take rawly powerful cards first rather than like 1-drops or 2-drops, because those, well, it's important to have a density of 1 and 2 drops. There's a lot of them. If people aren't fighting you at the table, if they're fighting you at the table, you shouldn't be in that, and you should realize that, right? But don't just like go first picking Isamaru, I would say. But how to pivot out of that strategy. So number one, it's much easier to pivot out of that strategy if you have those flexible cards early. But two, if you don't have those flexible cards early, try to prioritize dual lands, like black, red, and white, red dual lands, like I was saying a little bit earlier, so that you can, like, if you can't muster a monocolor deck, you can probably muster like mono red or close to mono red and a splash of 6 cards or whatever. That can only happen if you have those duels, right? So my best exit strategy is often pick up duels so I can play one other color, whatever it is, There seems to be a lot of +1/+1 stuff, +1/+1 counter stuff in green. Is that any good? I don't think so, no. I think the green aggro stuff, I mean, I don't want to say it can't be good, but I do believe that green is best at ramping, not being aggressive. There's a few aggressive cards that got added to the cube, like Kazandu Mammoth and Werewolf Pack Leader, that are like kind of interesting, but it's not super well supported. And I don't think, like, so I was saying before, there's not really like 2-color themes where it's like green white counters. I don't think you should be drafting like that, where you're doing a very specific thing. It would more be like, I'm drafting a white deck with like Conclave Mentor in there because I somehow happen to have a bunch of white counters incidentally. Or I'm drafting like a green aggressive deck, which I think is rare. And again, like, I incidentally have some green. So like, I wouldn't take Conclave Mentor, which is the green white gold card, and try to do that essentially. And that is true for most of the gold cards. Whereas in most limited formats, the gold cards are telling you what to do in that color pair. It's not so true in this cube format. It's more like they're supplementing strategies that exist, but they don't tell the full story. You're better off just doing like red aggro, white aggro, blue control, like what the base colors are doing essentially. Question, Mill, viable archetype with all the control. So I think Mill is an okay way to close out a game. I would prefer those expensive blue cards because I think they do a better job. They do a better job at closing out the game, but also aren't just dead against aggressive decks. So one of the problems with cards like Teferi's Tutelage and Patient Rebuilding is that they're really, really bad against any deck that's trying to attack you. Whereas something like Sublime Epiphany or Hullbreaker Horror can be pretty good against decks attacking you still, right? Like, you ramp into a Hullbreaker or you cast Epiphany on a key turn that's probably going to stop you from dying. Whereas the mill stuff, not so much. So where I know a lot of people like took, are very frustrated with the card Teferi's, not Teferi's Protection, Teferi's Tutelage, the one that mills from M21 in this cube. Because when you're playing like a green ramp deck or a control deck and that thing resolves, you're like, wow, that's a big problem. But that card's really, really bad versus the aggro decks. So I would more prefer my finishers to be able to interact with the aggro decks in a meaningful way. Like, what Mill provides you is it's a super resilient finisher versus another control deck, right? Where their removal spells, for the most part, don't interact with those enchantments or stuff like that. But I think what you gain versus the controlling decks does not make up for what you lose versus the aggressive decks, essentially. So it could be a pretty good sideboard thing to do. I don't think it's a good main deck thing. Do you think the aggro archetypes take a meaningful hit in best of 3? I think if you're not prepared for post board, yes. But if you have drafted some of those more expensive cards for post board, you can sideboard just as well as the aggressive deck. As the controlling decks, right? Like that's the issue in best of 3. I'm not so worried about like the hand smoother and whatever. I mean that definitely makes the aggressive decks a bit better, but I don't think like so much more meaningfully so that I feel bad about drafting an aggressive deck in best of 3. It's more that post board the controlling decks have good tools against you most of the time. But if you do a good job picking up those bigger grindy cards, I think you can contend with them, and I'm not really that afraid of post board best of 3 for aggro decks. I've heard you're better off carving a lane than bobbing and weaving. What do you do if your lane starts to dry up? I would not agree with that. I would say flexibility is still pretty important. I think carving your lane's pretty bad, actually. Maybe not really bad. Maybe pretty bad is like a little, it's going too far. But I think one of the themes throughout this podcast has been valuing flexibility and carving your lane. I mean, if you start to carve your lane and it's like, oh, cool, that worked out, great. But the times that doesn't work, you end up with a big mess because unlike normal limited, where you start to draft kind of a controlling deck and then that's not so open, you can go, okay, I can shift a little bit more back through the middle. You can't do that if you're like hard drafting control deck or hard drafting an aggro deck. So yeah, I would contest that that claim. I guess I would say. So just be flexible. All right, let's wrap up from there, chat. Thank you so much for hanging out once again. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. Good luck, everybody, this weekend, and happy cubing, everybody.